Paylocity presents Healthcare Reform Beyond the Hype. In this series, we're looking at the shared responsibility provision of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Play or Pay. This again takes effect with plan years beginning on or after January 1st of 2014. If you recall, shared responsibility requires that large employers must offer an affordable health plan providing minimum value to 95% of all full-time employees or face a penalty. In this video, we're looking to crack the code of full-time employee determination. In doing so, we first need to talk about who, according to the Affordable Care Act, should be eligible for benefits. Now, keep in mind that as an employer, you can have a more generous policy than what we talk about here, but in particular, we're looking at the ACA itself. So according to the ACA, if an individual is reasonably expected to work full-time, they are eligible for benefits. Now, where things get tricky is for employees who are known as variable hour or seasonal employees. In that case, they may be eligible for benefits depending on whether or not they meet the test of a full-time employee. Now, under ACA provisions and shared responsibility, if an employee averages more than 30 hours of service per week in a month, they are considered a full-time employee. Now, originally, this determination was to be done each month. You can imagine the administrative burden that would place on an employer having to determine eligibility every 30 days, taking the steps to get employees enrolled and offer coverage, etc. Because of this, an optional safe harbor method was created that allows for an employer to determine full-time status by using a look-back measurement period. So, what is a measurement period for employers who are interested in using this method? A measurement period is a company-selected 3 to 12-month time frame that is used to determine whether a variable hour employee is full-time for the purpose of benefit eligibility. Now, if in that 3 to 12-month window the employee averages 30 hours per week or 130 hours per month, they are considered full-time for the purposes of the Affordable Care Act and must be offered insurance coverage. It's important to note here that there are two types of measurement periods. The standard measurement period is applied to all employees in a group, and we'll talk a little bit more about how employees are grouped later, and this generally begins and ends on the same date for all employees in that group. The initial measurement period is applied per newly hired variable hour employee and more or less coincides with the beginning of their employment. There are special allowances for new hires when determining full-time status, and we'll talk about that specifically when we discuss new hires in particular. The next concept we need to talk about is that of the stability period. Now, if an employee is found to be a full-time employee, meaning they've exceeded the 30 hours per week on average or 130 hours per month, and if they elect coverage, that coverage is enforced for the following stability period. In a standard measurement period, the following stability period in general is the same length as a measurement period, but cannot be less than 6 months long. For new hires, it's a little bit different. There's some flexibility in how we measure that, but for new hires as well, that stability period cannot be less than 6 months. There's also a concept of an administrative period. The idea behind the administrative period is this is a period of up to 90 days to allow an employer to determine eligibility, get people enrolled, etc. That again can be up to 90 days, and to prevent gaps in coverage, this administrative period must overlap with the prior stability period. We're going to lay all this out momentarily. It's also important to note that when we talk about new hires, we have some additional flexibility here in terms of how we design that process. We do want to quickly talk about waiting periods. Now, as part of the Affordable Care Act, once an employee is determined to be full-time or otherwise eligible for coverage, the maximum waiting period for that coverage to take effect is 90 days. So we'll need to work that requirement in when we look at how we handle measurement and waiting periods, as we'll see momentarily. Let's take a look at that on our screen right now. So we have a sample timetable listed with months crossing a few different years. The first scenario we'll look at is that of an employer electing a 3-month measurement or look-back period. Now, in that case, you'll see that the look-back period, or the period of time that hours are actually measured, happen every 3 months. Following that is our administrative period of up to 90 days, where we determine who's eligible, take the necessary enrollment or unenrollment steps, and that coverage is then in effect for 6 months. You will remember that the coverage is in effect for 6 months, even though we're only measuring based off of 3 months, because that stability period can never be less than 6 months. If we take a look at an example of an employer who's elected a 6-month look-back measurement period, in this case we'll see that those hours are being measured over a 6-month period. They again have up to 90 days to administer who's eligible or not to get them covered, and the stability coverage period in this case matches that 6-month measurement period. In the example of an employer electing a 12-month measurement period, that looks similar to what you see at the bottom of your screen. This is where now we have a 12-month look-back period, in this case October to September. The employer then has 90 days to determine who's covered or not, take the necessary steps, and that coverage is in effect then for another 12 months following that administrative period. The key thing to note here in all 3 cases is to prevent gaps in coverage, that administrative period always overlaps with the prior stability coverage period. We do want to talk specifically about additional flexibility and options that employers have when dealing with new hires in their initial measurement period. One key statute in the Affordable Care Act stipulates that for newly hired variable hour employees, the initial measurement period combined with an allowable administrative period cannot extend beyond, quote, the last day of the first calendar month beginning on or after the 1-year anniversary of the employee's start date. Now that's a bit of an ACT question there, so let's go ahead and lay this out. With our sample employee, I'll call her Denise F. Now, let's assume that Denise were hired on March 15th, so we've got that lined out on the timeline down below. As such, her anniversary, of course, is in the following March. The statute stipulates that the measurement and administrative period combined cannot exceed beyond the last day of the calendar month after their anniversary, so that needs to end by the end of that April, and her coverage then needs to take effect in the beginning of May. Now, if you'll notice, we do have a compressed time frame here. So if her anniversary was March 15th and her coverage needs to start May 1st, this employer has essentially 6 weeks for Denise to take the administrative steps necessary. In particular, this means that employers that pick an 11 or 12-month measurement period cannot use a full 90-day administrative period for new hires in their initial measurement period. Now, there are a number of special allowances for new hires to provide some sort of administrative relief. The first is that for newly hired variable hour employees, that initial measurement period is allowed to be 1 month shorter than the stability period. So in that last example with Denise, where we had just the 6 weeks to administer coverage to get her enrolled for the stability period, you can actually measure for 11 months instead of 12, which will give you an extra month to administer enrollment for that employee, and the stability period or coverage period can still be 12 months long. So if you're concerned about a cushion for taking care of the administrative tasks, that's one administrative relief that's available to you. Another allowance for new hires in particular is that an employer is able to use portions of that up to 90-day measurement period before actually starting to measure hours. So in the case of Denise again, she was hired on March 15th. You can choose in her case to use 15 days administrative period at the beginning of her hire and actually start measuring hours once April rolls around. This could be beneficial for employers where employees tend to terminate quickly in the first few weeks, or if employers aren't actively tracking hours or the time is not productive at the beginning of their employment. One important concept to note for new hires is that measurement of the initial and standard ongoing measurement period happens simultaneously. So going back to Denise here, her initial measurement period extends from March 15th, from her date of hire to the following year. And we have the 6 weeks administrative period and the stability coverage period that follows, assuming that she met the definition of a full-time employee, that extends another 12 months after. Okay. Now, in this case, if her employer also has a standard measurement period, let's say that starts October 1, once that next standard measurement period begins, she's measured against both periods simultaneously. What this means is if she were eligible for coverage under her initial measurement period, and if she elected coverage, her coverage would start on May 1. If under the standard measurement period she was not defined as a full-time employee, her coverage would still be in effect from the first initial stability period, and that would run from May 1 to April 30th of the following year. At that point, depending on how the plan is designed, her coverage may be dropped because she no longer meets the definition of a full-time employee. An employer is allowed to have multiple measurement and stability periods for different classes of employees. So you can apply different measurement and stability period rules for hourly employees and salaried employees, for union employees and non-union employees. If you have multiple unions, you can use different rules between unions. You can also treat employers different within each employer in an affiliated group. So if there's controlled ownership or an affiliated group of companies, each member in that group can have a different measurement and stability period rule. And multi-state employers can have different measurement and stability period rules for each state of employment. Now, it's important to note that regardless of how your employees are classified, all employees in the same class must be measured uniformly. There are a number, of course, practical considerations when discussing what measurement period is optimal. In general, the overall feeling is that most employers are likely to elect a 12-month look-back period, since this is the easiest to administer of all options, and the longer time frame evens out spikes from busy seasons and seasonal employment. We have heard that some employers are looking at shorter-term look-back periods as a recruitment tool. So, for example, a restaurant chain on the West Coast told me they would be using a 6-month look-back period as a way of attracting, very experienced hosts and hostesses to their staff. They'd be able to tell them you can be eligible for coverage in as little as 6 months, as opposed to a year, potentially, with other employers. Okay. We do have some additional rules that we want to make sure we consider around rehires, specifically for our variable hour employees. Now, under proposed regulations, if a variable hour employee has no creditable hours of service for 26 weeks, they can be treated as a new employee for the purpose of determining their full-time status. There's also a proposed rule of parity whereby a rehire can be treated as a new employee, meaning that entire average hours calculation resets, if the employee has no creditable hours of service for at least 4 weeks and the length of service without creditable hours is greater than the length of time of employment. If we take a look at that rule of parity in particular, let's say that we have a variable hour employee that works for 3 weeks, terminates, and is then rehired 10 weeks after terminating. That rehire can be treated as a new employee for purposes of determining full-time status for benefit eligibility, and that's because that 10-week absence service is greater than the preceding 3 weeks of service that was rendered.